The time is 11:08 a.m. September 2nd, 2021, a Thursday morning. The news headline: What I did that made God to stop talking to me. Pastor Adeboye reviews. The news in full. Pastor Adeboye recalls an encounter that made God stop talking to him during one of his teachings. Almost immediately after I got born again, God started speaking to me. I didn't do anything without his guidance or approval. He tells me the road to play in Lagos so that I can bypass Hold Up. Most of you here know how terrible Lagos traffic is. Fortunately for me, I don't experience it because God knows a better route. However, something happened that made him stop communicating with me. I used to be an interpreter to the general overseer, or general superintendent like we call it in those days. My father in the Lord then just took a special interest in my interpretation. When other pastors in the church then realized that the general overseer liked my interpretation, they stopped calling me to interpret for them and left me alone for the general overseer. I became full of myself and started bouncing around as interpreter to the general overseer. But an incident happened one day. We had a program and we invited a minister guest to preach. He made a mistake that day. You may be surprised at my definition of a mistake. The mistake was that he asked me to interpret for himself. I was really angry in my spirit, but I couldn't object because it was too late. I stood up and interpreted for him, but in my heart, I was murmuring. I said, "How could you call me, a whole interpreter to the general overseer, to interpret for you?" Only if he knew what was in my mind, he would have called another person to interpret that very day. At the end of the program, I was on my way home and God spoke to me and said, "Son, you are now too big to interpret to a man of God other than the general overseer." After the conversation, God stopped speaking to me. I didn't hear his voice again. I suffered. That whole period was like hell. I became a victim of the traffic in Lagos. I don't know how Christians survive without God speaking with them. After many months, I got tired of my situation. I prayed a desperate prayer. I said, "God, it is either you start speaking to me again or you take my life." When God saw that I realized my ego and was desperate to hear his voice again, he answered and started speaking to me again. Brethren, till now, I hear very clearly the voice of God. To conclude his sermon, which lasted for 45 minutes, Pastor Adeboye admonishes believers, especially young pastors and vibrant ministers of God, to do away with anything that is associated with pride, because it can be heaven to be shot against such fellow. The time is 11:11 a.m. The analysis. Pastor Adeboye of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, who is the general overseer and the superintendent, actually recalls an encounter that made God stop talking to him in one of his teachings. As we all know that the pastor is a respected figure in the Nigerian politics and even in the citizen and across all countries, where the Redeemed Christian Church of God has been dominating every sphere of the nation. He said that almost after he got born again, God started speaking to him, and there was nothing that he would want to do without an approval or the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Then he cited an incident whereby there is no time he wants to ply the route of Lagos State, because everybody knows that Lagos State is actually a busy state where there are terrible traffic almost every blessed day. He said that every time he's flying through Lagos, there is always a directive from God on where he should pass that would make him not to experience the terrible traffic, and that fortunately for him, he doesn't experience any traffic because God is to show him a better route to pass. However, something happened that made him stop that made God stop communicating with him. He said, in those days, he used to be the interpreter to the general overseer, or as at then they call it, general superintendent, and that the general overseer then took a special interest in him because of his unique way and fluency in interpretation. And when other pastors in the church realized that the general overseer liked the manners of which he does his own interpretation, all of them stopped calling him and left him alone for the general overseer to make use of. Then he cited that because of this, he became full of himself and started bouncing around as interpreter to the general overseer. But that an incident happened one day. Thereby they had a program and they invited a guest minister to preach. And during the preaching, he was saying in his mind that the guest minister who had called him to interpret for him had done a mistake. And the mistake to him was that he was angry in the spirit that he could be called, a whole hymn, a general overseer interpreter could be called to interpret, but he couldn't object because it was too late for him to do that. He said he stood up and went ahead to interpret for him, but in his own mind, he was unsettled and unhappy. That how would a whole interpreter to the general overseer be called to interpret to just a guest minister, even while other pastors do not call him again, leaving him aside for only the general overseer's use during interpretation. He said, had it been that the guest minister could read his mind that very day, he would have known that he shouldn't have called him and would have opted out to call another person entirely. And that at the end of the program, while he was on his way home, God spoke to him, and while God was speaking to him, God told him that you are too big to interpret to a man of God other than the general overseer. That must have been as a result of what he was nursing in his mind, because God sees the mind rather than even what we do. And after that conversation that God had with him, he didn't hear from God again. That very day it stopped, and that he cited that he suffered a whole lot of hell during that period, that he now becomes a victim of traffic in Lagos. As at then God used to tell him this is where to pass or not, but he began to suffer traffic and all those stuff like that, and a whole lot of issues. That life was so desperate for him that he had to pray and fast to God until God now saw that he has realized his ego and mistake, and that ever since then he has been hearing very clearly from God. And to conclude his sermon, which lasted for about 45 minutes, he admonishes believers, especially young pastors and vibrant ministers of God, that they should do away with anything associated with pride, because it was pride as at then that stopped God from communicating with him. The time is 11:16 a.m. Good morning.